Termo to Madeline, Audio Edition, Skeleton Flat, Chapter 1, A Case in Favor of Legend. Long before white settlers came to the Madeline Plains to run their livestock and plow and irrigate its soils, Indians were there. There is no record to show that they ever lived there for any extended length of time. There is, however, extensive evidence showing that they used the vast expanses of the Madeline Plains as a colossal hunting reserve. Stories have been handed down from generation to generation among the Warm Spring Indians that tell of enormous hunting parties leaving the South Fork in the springs and summers of years long since past. These hunting parties spent many days hunting the antelope of the Madeline Plains and Painter Flat. The Indians' use of the plains began to change, however, with the advent of the white man to the Honey Lake Valley. 10 long years before the first settler landed on the Madeline Plains, the Pit River Indians began to see a new use for the area besides hunting. The first record of Indians using it as an escape route from the white man who began to settle Honey Lake comes in March of 1858. At that time, some Indians stole 6 or 8 head of cattle from Charles Adams, a rancher headquartered near where the town of Standish now is. A posse of men was quickly formed, and the Indians were trailed out through Secret Valley across the Madeline Plains to Cold Springs in Clark Valley, before their trail was lost, and the white men came home without any revenge. Just a month later, some Pit River Indians stole 2 horses and 2 mules from Fred Hines and U.J. Tutt, Honey Lake ranchers, from near where the town of Susanville is today. Tutt and Williams Dow, 2 of the best Indian fighters in the valley, started tracking the Indians until they had the general direction they were going. They then organized a party of men and set out in pursuit. The Indians were followed out over what is now called Antelope Grade into Willow Creek Valley. The next day they were trailed on past Eagle Lake and into Grasshopper Valley. Grasshopper Lake was high at that time, and they spent all night trying to sneak up on an Indian campfire on the far side of the mud and ice. Finally, just after daylight, the Indians were ambushed, and all 4 of them killed. These were not the right Indians, however, so the chase continued out through Dry Valley and on to the Madeline Plains. The whites trailed the Indians along the west side as far as the Marsh Springs that day and camped there for the night. They continued onward in hot pursuit over the next several days, and the chase finally culminated in a skirmish east of Goose Lake, where at least 17 Indians were killed, 2 white men wounded, and 8 horses killed and 8 more wounded. The Honey Lakers eventually got back home with 17 scalps and 1 of the original stolen horses. Over the next several years, many parties of Honey Lake ranchers were organized to go after Indians who had either stolen livestock or killed white settlers. Invariably, their trails led either into the Smoke Creek Desert or the Madeline Plains. Sometimes Indians were killed, and sometimes the whites came back worse for the wear. These more or less continuous Indian troubles brought about the establishment of the Exterminators. This was a secret society, or lodge, organized in Susanville, and its adherents were sworn to kill all Indians on sight. Since it was a secret society, it is next to impossible to trace except through legend and bits and pieces of information here and there. Exactly when it was organized is questionable. Fairfield sets a date in the summer of 1868 and claims it ended not too long after. but due to the nature of the organization, one wonders if it may not have been in effect before that time and lasted a good many years afterwards, as the legends go. Supposedly, it was composed mostly or entirely of Masons, which is entirely possible considering that a majority of Honey Lakers were Masons. Peter Lassen had brought a Masonic charter to California with him, and Lassen Lodge, number 149, Susanville's Masonic Lodge, was established as early as 1861. At any rate, there's another legend which deserves some strong consideration. When studied with some of the known facts, it comes to life and appears very possible. This story says that a white family was killed by the Indians in the vicinity of Wendell Hot Springs. A posse of exterminators chased them for several days into the mountains, where they finally overtook them in a valley. There the whites massacred them all, men, women, and children. The bodies were piled up in an enormous stack, and the posse returned to Honey Lake. The skeletons, and later the scattered bones of these Indians, remained visible for many years afterwards, and the valley gradually became known as Skeleton Flat. If there is a word of truth in this legend, it would stand to reason that it would forever remain a legend. Men of a secret society working outside the law would certainly not document and sign their names to such a story, but it would be passed along by word of mouth among trusted friends and family. Now for a look at the facts. On April 17th, 1868, Thomas Pearson, his wife, daughter, and a fellow named Samuel Cooper were brutally murdered by Indians between Hot Springs and Honey Lake. Two posses were immediately formed, independently of each other, to pursue the renegades. One came from Susanville, and the other out of Long Valley. The Long Valley posse caught up to the others above Secret Valley 4 days later. There, some of both parties went on out across the Madeline Plains, and some of both parties went home. We will now examine what Fairfield has to say on the subject. According to him, and he got his information from Charles Lassen and Thomas Brown, two members of the combined posse, the whites spent the entire day trailing the Indians across the east end of the Madeline Plains. The flat was flooded, and water was anywhere from a few inches to 3 feet deep. After wallowing through water and mud on the flat and around huge snowdrifts, as much as 50 feet long and 6 feet deep in the hills on the far side of the plains, the posse arrived at Maiden Valley. It was already evening, and the men and horses were pretty well exhausted. As they were eating supper, they could see Warm Springs Mountain in the distance. Upon finishing up the meal, 4 and possibly 5 of them set out as scouts on foot for the top of the mountain, where they arrived at about 10 o'clock at night. From the summit they could see the Indians' campfire on a flat close to the Warm Springs. Charles Lawson was in this group. He was sent back to tell the others to meet the scouts at Warm Springs. It was dark, and the country was strange to him. He spent a long time falling and lost both boot heels. But since there was a natural pass from Warm Springs to Maiden Valley, he arrived back in time to dispatch the main posse, and they rendezvoused with the scouts at Warm Springs about daylight. The Indians had already fled, but the posse picked up on their trail after a quick breakfast and followed it to the South Fork of the Pitt River. The river was very high, and the current was like a mill race where the tracks of the Indians went into it. The whites couldn't find any place they dared attempt to cross the torrent, so they turned back and returned to Honey Lake empty-handed. Anyone with a knowledge of the country in question will have already seen that Lawson and Brown's story is a pure fabrication. To begin with, it is not possible to see Warm Springs Mountain from Maiden Valley. Beyond that, it should be remembered that the men were exhausted after fighting mud, ice, and snow all day. If the snow was bad before arriving at Maiden Valley, it could have done nothing but get worse at higher elevations. Furthermore, there is no such thing as a natural pass between Warm Springs and Maiden Valley, and yet at least one of the 4 or 5 scouts traversed all the way from Maiden Valley to the top of Warm Springs Mountain and back via this alleged pass, at a distance of, at the very least, 45 miles. And all of this in the dark with no boot hills? Then he still arrived in time for the main posse to meet the scouts at Warm Springs by daylight? And there's yet another question raised at the South Fork. At the very most, the Indians could have crossed the river only a few hours ahead of the posse. And yet, in that little amount of time, the river had gotten so wild that the whites had to stop where the Indians had just gone across. So let us examine something that might be a little more plausible. From Maiden Valley, McDonald Peak is very visible and only about 3 miles distant. From McDonald Peak, Skeleton Flat is very visible and lies to the northeast, just as Warm Springs lies in perspective of Warm Springs Mountain. There is a definite pass between Skeleton Flat and Maiden Valley, and if the entire circuit was made, the distance would not be over 10 miles, something that would be slightly more possible to cover in one night and have a posse back to Skeleton Flat by daylight. And what did the posse do upon arrival there? Well, the legend says they massacred the Indians and piled the bodies up like cord wood. So the reader can take his choice between legend and documentation. Whatever choice he makes, however, Skeleton Flat is there to be reckoned with. It certainly did not get its name from the daisies. In next episode, we'll hear about MacDonald and Geller, 2 tough bachelors.